Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. Today we're going to look at the closed Spanish opening. Now this is an opening that all of the world champions have played one or the other side of. So these are openings of great strategic depth and richness, and they are definitely an opening worth knowing about and including in your repertoire as either white or as black, or just as for learning some of the sort of important ideas of chess. So we've got a little agenda here for what we're going to cover. We are going to start, we're going to ask, how did we get here? In other words, how do you arrive at the closed Spanish? We're going to talk about then different kinds of closed Spanish, so different ways that black can handle the closed Spanish. The Shigarin, the Breuer, the Zaitsev, the words are lovely, aren't they? The Keras system, and then at the end, if you want to do something completely different, we have some options for playing it very, very differently. So firstly, we're going to ask the question, which is, how did we get here? How do you arrive at the closed Spanish, and what are the options along the way? Now, we shouldn't get too bogged down in this because there's a whole load of other interesting options along the way. But let's just look at the moves running up to the closed Ruy Lopez or the closed Spanish. So white plays pawn to e4. Black plays pawn to e5. Classical stuff. White develops a king's knight and attacks the pawn. Black defends. White attacks that knight and perhaps indirectly attacks the e-pawn, although there's a long way to go. Now black's got some options here. Black can play the knight f6, the Berlin defense, which was introduced by Kramnik. I mean, it's been played for a long time. It's been known as a very solid option for black, particularly if black doesn't mind a draw. But Kramnik used it against Kasparov in their World Championship match to great effect, and Kasparov was not able to break down Kramnik's Berlin Wall, and if Kasparov can't do it, then it probably can't be done. And indeed, the elite players adopted the Berlin for a long time, and black was able to certainly frustrate white. I mean, there were very few white wins. It's a bit less popular now. The world's slightly moved on, but it's still a very reliable choice for black. So black can play knight f6. Black can also play pawn f5, the Schliemann defense. Great name, and I lost a league game to the Schliemann in my 20s years ago. It was a big surprise to me. I didn't really know how to handle it. And someone played it against me 2 months ago, and I lost there as well. So I'm consistent in my approach to the Schliemann. It is, it's sound. You have to know how to handle it. But if you know how to handle it, it's absolutely fine. I've got a bit more work to do there myself. Anyway, on the way to the closed, it's pawn a6. So we're not going to play the Berlin. We're not going to play the Schliemann. We're going to play the main line of the Spanish, which goes pawn a6. Now, at first sight, you might think you can take off that knight and then take the pawn on e5. So some might say takes, black takes back, takes here. That doesn't really work because black's got this move queen d4, attacking knight and pawn, and then when the knight comes back, black takes the pawn, and actually the engines say even black's a bit better here. So the truth is, when black plays pawn a6, you can take that knight, and this is called the exchange variation, which is a respectable variation. Someone else on Chess Corner has asked me, so I'm part of this international chess club called Chess Corner. The chap running it asked me to do this video in connection with a tournament that they're running in the closed Spanish. But someone else there asked me to do the exchange. So in the future, we'll do the exchange. But today we're going to do the closed. So in the closed, what happens is white backs off to a4. Black brings out the king's knight. Let's just whiz through. White castles. Now, black can take that pawn. It is undefended. This is a known line. This is the open Spanish, not the closed Spanish. White has various options here, of which pawn d4 is the best. You can play rook e1 as well, but pawn d4 is the best. But we're not going to look at this. We are going to look at the closed, and so the closed involves just developing the bishop. White then defends the pawn. Black pushes that bishop away. Again here, black can castle, hinting at the Marshall attack. That's another video. White can play an anti-Marshall. Or white can play c3 and black can play d6, transposing back into the closed. But anyway, we're not going to look at castles at the moment. We're going to look at pawn d6. White plays c3, making a hole for that bishop and supporting the idea of d4. Black castles, and then white plays h3. stopping the bishop coming to g4 to pin the knight. Now this is the closed proper. It also creates a hole for the king. Here, you know, black has a whole string of options, and we're going to go through them one by one. So the next one we're going to go through is the Chigorin, Chigorin, depending on how you pronounce it, from black. This is an opening with a lot of history. It's sound. It's a very rich strategic positions. We're only going to look at one or two lines because there just isn't time to look at these such deep, interesting openings in enormous depth. But it's definitely worth looking at. So first knight goes to a5, attacking that bishop. Bishop runs back to c2. That's a valuable bishop for white. Black is then able to play c5. The knight's moved is able to play c5, which grabs a bit of space, exerts some control over d4, but actually leaves the d5 square a little bit weak. White plays d4, can play d3, bit less ambitiously, but plays d4. Best move, or the most common move for black here, is queen c7, because that e-pawn was attacked twice by white, with the d-pawn and with the knight. Garry Kasparov in his early teens, played d5 here to some effect, and actually shows what a good player Kasparov is. Deep, Fritz and Komodo both want to play d5. But the most commonly played move is this, the knight move. The knight's basically making its way to the king's side. Black opens the file here, although there's other things that, you know, black can do. There's quite a lot of choice at each stage here. I mean, that's what makes it chess. Knight goes back to c6 on this line. White has to defend the d-pawn. This is just an example now. White defends the d-pawn. Black can press a5, sort of threatening to attack that knight and then pick up the d-pawn. So white defends it with the bishop. Black pushes, the knight comes back. Black sensibly develops the bishop and connects the rooks. White puts his rook opposite the queen. Black moves away, and then the white knight starts to make its time-honoured passage to the king's side through f1 and then onto g3 to perhaps start an attack on the king's side. The black rook comes to e8, knight comes to g3, and then on this in this line the bishop's manoeuvring through d8, heading for the queen's side. So this is one way of handling the Chigorin, but the basic idea is that it's knight a5 that starts the Chigorin, and broadly speaking the theme is black's playing on the queen's side, white is probably attacking on the king's side. Black has to be careful of the weak square on d5, which Bobby Fischer was very good at exploiting, and black has to be a little careful that his pawns don't get fixed, but it's an interesting system. So let's look at the next option for black, and this is the Breuer system. This again, this is a wonderful system, and it's a hyper-modern concept. So the basic idea is that black is going to put pressure on the white centre, and he's going to do that by regrouping the knight back to b8 and then through d7, making way for the bishop to come to b7, and also again letting that c-pawn get moving. So the characteristic move that begins the Breuer is knight b8. Now, you have to be a pretty creative, open-minded chess player to make a move like knight b8, because, of course, we're taught to develop our pieces, and he's just undeveloping the knight. I mean, he's doing it to redevelop it to a better square, because now the position's developed, knight c6 is not as useful, but certainly it takes some vision to do that. White occupies the centre with d4, black brings the knight back to d7, white again brings a knight to d2, defending that e-pawn, which will become a point of focus. Black attacks, again white is bringing that bishop back, so it's protecting, and it's sort of overprotecting, as Aaron Nimzowitsch used to say, overprotecting that e-pawn, because it allows some of the other pieces to move away if they want to. Black moves the rook onto the e-file, again perhaps indirectly attacking that e-pawn if black were to take on d4. The white knight comes to f1, making its way to g3. The bishop backs up, and now we do have that indirect attack on the e-pawn. So black takes on d4, white takes back, and then the white pawn will be hanging, so white defends it. Now black's playing g6 to stop the knight jumping in. White plays a4, again very typical in the Spanish, to undermine those pawns on the queen side. Black's playing pawn c5 to attack the white centre. White locks the centre. And then this is very typical as well. Black is playing c4 to give the knight the option of that c5 square. So it gives the knight that chance. Bishop g5. I'm going to stop there for the moment because there were so many different choices at each move here. But it just gives you a general sense of what's happening. Again, it's a very sound opening for Black. Black places pressure on the white centre, and in the end that forces concessions from White. And here, really, the game is just beginning. The next line was developed by Igor Zaitsev, Anatoly Karpov's second, and it was used by Karpov in various matches, but it was used in the World Championship match against Kasparov with a lot of success. I mean, actually, Kasparov won some of them, and Karpov won some of them, and some of them were a draw. But it was the ideas were developed in those matches, and they were shown to be very powerful. So instead of bringing the knight back to b8, Breuer style, what happens in the Zaitsev is bishop b7. And again, the theme is going to be pressure, active defence, pressure on the white centre. So bishop b7. White plays d4, although I think White can play d3 in this position, and that makes the white centre, that makes the e-pawn a bit stronger, but it's a bit less ambitious. But that is playable. Rook e8 here. And now what's interesting is there is a drawing line here. So White can play knight g5, attacking that weak f-pawn, and then the rook can come back. And then if White backs up to knight f3, then the rook goes back again. So Karpov played and had quick draws with a number of strong grandmasters in this line. I think the basic logic is Karpov was super strong, and if they're both feeling tired that day, the grandmaster playing the white pieces might just say, okay, I'm going to accept a draw and ask for a draw by repetition here. These days, players like Carlsen are much less willing to do that, but at the time, culturally, it was a bit more acceptable. So anyway, the point is, if you're playing it as a club player, it's important to remember that actually White has the option of going for a draw, unless Black changes plan and plays h6 to stop the knight repeatedly coming to g5. But if White doesn't look for a draw, there's knight bd2, the bishop backs off, and then there's two options here, a3 or a4. We're going to look at a4. It's a little bit more fiery. Black plays h6 ordinarily, the bishop's coming back. And then this is very typical of the Zaitsev. So Black's exchanging here. So he gives White the centre, but he also gives himself a beautiful outpost for his knight on b4. So that knight goes to b4. The bishop's backing up. And White's bishops are a little bit tangled up here. And I think basically the struggle is, if White's able to free the bishops, then he gets the better game. There's many examples here. So c5 is the main line. We're going to look at a Karpov-Kasparov game where Karpov took on a4. Kasparov took back. Plays a5 to defend the knight. The rook comes to a3. And actually the rook often comes to a3 in the Zaitsev. Black plays rook a6. Knight White takes the knight to h2. And actually Jan Timman in the qualifying rounds played knight h4. Now this doesn't work because Black can take there, and actually Black equalises. It's not winning for Black, but equalises. It's complicated, and it's a really fun little project to work out what's going on there. But certainly that knight on h4 is hanging, so there's lots of exciting. It's quite an interesting position to analyse. But so knight h4 for White is not recommended. Knight h2 is a good move. Karpov played pawn g6. And then Kasparov just plays f3 to reinforce the centre, reinforce that central e-pawn. Queen d7, knight c4. I'm just going to make a few moves. Obviously, this is an incredibly high-powered game because basically after knight g8, there's a brilliant sacrifice by Kasparov. And again, in this short video, we're not going to try and unravel the consequences of this. White's able to take on h6. Now, the sort of simple analysis would say, well, that pawn is defended 3 times by king, knight, and bishop, and it's only attacked 3 times, so this is losing a piece. But that ignores the fact that the pawn on d6 is vulnerable, defended by the f8 bishop, and that taking that pawn is a fork. So bishop takes, knight takes, and then there's this fork. Queen moves, white picks off the rook, and then the queen's taking there. So this, this was a world championship match, and so this isn't the time to analyse every single detail. But broadly speaking here, white has, the computers here have white winning, and Kasparov in the end did win. And that is a really good game to look at. This does not mean the Zaitsev system is unsound. I mean, actually, my own view is way back here, instead of taking on a4, and Karpov did this in later games, c5 is the better move. But I mean, even taking on a4 isn't unsound. I mean, it was a long game. White plays d5, knight d7, and again we're going to look at another Karpov-Kasparov game, rook a3. Okay, so here actually in this position, black Karpov in one game did play f5 to try to break up the white centre. I'm just trying to give a sense of the different variety of plans that are possible. Kasparov took, Karpov played knight to f6, Kasparov played here, and then Karpov, I think, spent 53 minutes or something thinking about this move, but Karpov took on d5. And again, this is an extremely complicated position. Kasparov offered an exchange sacrifice in the middle. Not entirely sound, I would add, exchange sacrifice here. But in practice, very hard for a human player to handle. Karpov didn't take it straight away. Very complicated. I think this game ended in a draw. But again, very rich and complicated play. But so the broad idea of the Zaitsev, the broad idea is that bishop comes to b7, the rook comes to e8, black doesn't waste time on h6, and then the bishop comes back to f8, putting pressure on the white centre. Often black takes on d4 and develops an outpost for the knight on b4, pushing the bishop back possibly to b1. Okay, so we've looked at the Broyer, we've looked at the Zaitsev. Now, a slightly less popular system. Brainchild of Paul Keres, again a great Russian player, was a world champion and a very well respected player, as world champions tend to be, but a very strong and solid player. And Keres's idea was essentially to move the knight back in the closed to d7. That knight can jump to b6, perhaps supporting d5 later on, but it's also supporting that black e-pawn. White plays pawn d4, black's playing the bishop to f6, again supporting that e5 pawn of black's, but also putting pressure on the white d4 pawn. White, again, this is thematic, isn't it, in the Spanish, threatening to break up those pawns on the queen's side, brings out the knight, again attacking the pawns, takes, and again you've got the rook coming to e8 to put pressure on the white e-pawn. Black takes. Now, black can't take here on b5 because the rook on a1 would hang. So moves the bishop out first to renew the threat. Black is then playing slightly in Shigarin style to push that bishop, and the bishop retreats to c2. So again, you've got some of the same themes emerging, but what characterises the Keres is knight d7, bishop f6, and again shoring up that e-pawn and possibly putting pressure on d4, white's d4 square. The engines don't quite like it as much. So the engines, the modern engines, would choose the Zaitsev or the Broyer with the Shigarin just behind, and the Keres a little bit behind that. But it's important to say, the Keres, I would say, is sound. Now for something completely different, we're going to look at some openings which are probably still sound, but are a little bit more innovative. So a little bit less common. So this is really all about what happens on the 9th move. So here, what have we got on the 9th move? We've got some more options. We've got bishop e6, where black just takes on that bishop straight away and asks to exchange it. So backing off to c2 looks a bit passive here and gives black everything he wants. I mean, I assume, yeah, I mean, so I think retreating doesn't feel right here. The engines want to either take on e6 and give black that slight weakness of the double pawns and the weakness around the king, or play d4. But bishop e6 is, you know, it's not unsound, and it might surprise people. Perhaps over the board rather than in correspondence, but, you know, it's your game. It's all your game. h6 is the Smyslov line, which is also valid. Perhaps a little bit passive, but, you know, not wrong. And then we've got quite an interesting idea here, which is pawn to a5. So the idea behind this is it's slightly chasing away that bishop with the pawn. So white plays d4, and then black just charges on, pawn a4. And one of the things black can try to do here is to actually swap off that light square bishop, which white's rather fond of. So, for instance, it could go... black could takes, and then actually black can go straight and then attack this this bishop on c2. So that is another line to research, and I think that will surprise your opponents. You know, this idea of playing pawn a5. Again, I think perhaps more across the board than in correspondence, because in correspondence people are going to, well, if they're very keen, they're going to start looking it up in books and thinking of what to do. But it's not wrong in correspondence either. Anyway, that's what I think the major options are in the closed Spanish. I very much hope you have a good tournament. I very much hope you enjoy playing these options. I'll be watching the tournament to see what everybody plays and what the ideas are. If you have feedback, or you have other variations you'd like, or you have other things you'd like me to cover, please do say so in the comments. But until then, keep enjoying the chess.